We are so pleased to be joined by Lilith Dorsey, who is an author, speaker, magical practitioner and academic. Their first initiation came from Mambo Bonnie Devlin, and their academic work has focused on ritual dance and possession on film. Lilith edits Ocean African Magical Quarterly and is the creation of the critically acclaimed experimental documentary Bodies of Water, Voodoo Identity and the Transformation. Lilith is the author of numerous books, including Voodoo and Afro-Caribbean Paganism, Water Magic, and Orishas, Goddesses and Voodoo Queens, the Divine Feminine in the African Religious Traditions. Their work has been featured in the New York Times and the Village Voice. Lilith was also choreographer for jazz legend Dr. John's Night Tripper Voodoo show, and in July 2013, they led their first ever Voodoo Zombie Silent Rave, complete with very confused thriller flash mob. And we will be linking to Lilith's website later on. We're also just so delighted to welcome Sabrina Scott. Sabrina Scott is a doctoral student in Science and Technology Studies at York University in Toronto. Their MA dissertation, Witchbody, a rambling and poetic autoethnography of Western occult magic as a pathway for environmental learning and advocacy, won the 2016 LGBT Youth Line Outstanding Achievements in Post-Secondary Academic Environment Award. Scott views magic as a way of building relationships with non-human beings. You, me, plants, trees, coffee cups, and garbage bins. Their forthcoming Curse and Cure is a guide to working with magic and witchcraft in the real world. Scott maintains a professional design and illustration practice using comics, zines, and book arts to work through critical theory, philosophy, ethics, spirituality, sensation, and social justice. So please join me in welcoming our two wonderful speakers. Hello, this is such a joy. Thank you so much for joining me and everybody here. We are already seeing some lively, joyful discussion in the chat, and we do encourage your questions. But firstly, I wanted to ask you both a question, which is, I suppose, my privilege as the chair, which is that both of your talks touch on what I would sort of frame as diverse animistic practices. And I wondered if you could both talk to us just a little bit about what your talks kind of in very brief cover and kind of where you find animism in your practices. So Lilith, would you go first for us?
Oh, sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you so much, Alice, for such a wonderful introduction. And thank you so much for having me on the panel. It was a joy to be able to make the short piece that I made for this event, because it allowed me to sort of use some of my visual training and background to explain what I think is a really hard concept for people who are not familiar with it to get in touch with. And in my traditions of African traditional religion, you know, Vodou, New Orleans Voodoo, Santo, or Lukumi, there's a strong concept of Ashe, which I think goes along these beliefs of animism that Sabrina touched on in their talks. And what it is that it's a sacred life force that permeates all things. And for us, everything has this Ashe, this sacred energy. It's sort of a spiritual force. It doesn't matter if it's an inanimate object or a natural object, everything possesses this Ashe, and we align ourselves with the Ashe of the things and the universe around us. So when I was asked to think about these questions of witch bodies and magic and ecology, for me, they're all sort of the same thing, because I'm seeing it through a different lens, through a lens where it has the true essence of the thing as opposed to the differences of the thing. So we sort of use the magic to find the commonalities in all of this. And this is something that's been fascinating to me, both in my academic study and my practice, by finding these things. And, you know, something as simple as, okay, if we talk about the Orisha Oshun, who's representative of the Ashe of the river, they're also representative of the ashe of honey and the ashe of the dance and the ashe of love and marriage and romance and nurturing children and all of these things. And it really is a giant corpus of information that goes into something that's such a simple words as the ashe of Oshun. So that's how I see it. And I think that's really where we can come together today for some of this discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I love this idea that we come upon this sort of life force, this idea from so many different angles, even between the three of us. So Sabrina, I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Alice, for having me. Thank you to Simone for the invite. And Lilith, I'm so absolutely overjoyed to be sharing space with you today in this conversation. So I'm just stoked, and thank you so much, everyone, for showing up and sharing some of your day or night with us on Zoomland. So Lilith, I love that you use the word corpus, because to me, this idea of like corpus, bodies, was really important for me in responding to the provocation that this conference gave me. And so whenever I see the word ecology, and especially within, conservationist, environmental studies communities, or if it's communities of magical practitioners and witches and occultists, I often see ecology as just being about plants and cute animals and all of that. And while I do love all of that stuff, I think it's so crucial that we cultivate an awareness of ourselves as beings within like that kind of organic environment. I also feel like it's so critical to expand our notion about what does ecology even mean, what constitutes ecology. And so in my little talk that I submitted, I really wanted to make sure that I was able to enter into the conversation some expansion of what ecology might mean, an expansion of what the word body might mean, whether it's bodies of knowledge, bodies of energy, bodies of conversation, bodies of discourse, or whether it's constructed, built bodies like a coffee cup or something like this. Like I do feel, oh, nice, cheers, Lilith. I think it's crucial in my mind that as people thinking about magic, people thinking about ecology, that we don't just sequester the built environment as something not cute over in the corner, and we just stick with this pristine, magical whatever. Like I think it's a bit wrong-sided to do that. It's important work, but it's not all of the work. And so I really wanted to make sure that I didn't just talk about cute plants in my talk. So that is more or less the short version of what inspired me to talk about what I spoke of, and especially thinking about the ecologies of the internet, social media, virality. We're thinking a lot about virality right now with being in a pandemic and all of this. So for me, magic and contagion and intention and manifestation, all of these concepts to me are interlinked with thinking about ecology in many different forms.
Thank you both so much. And I would like to say that the chat is already absolutely full of, somebody has just said that, Sabrina, your book, Witchbodies, has just popped through their door. And there has already been a recommendation for Orisha's Goddesses and Voodoo Queens. So the chat is absolutely full of talk already. So I have a question that's come in from someone called Jessica, which I'm going to move to now. I see that you've heard my call, audience, and you're already pouring questions in, so thank you. So we start with Jessica's question. Both speakers touched on the idea of body as co-constituted in their talks. Sabrina mentioned vaccines, and Lilith mentioned the influence of the Orisha's Ashe on the practitioner. Can we then think of ourselves as an ecological system, or ourselves as being part of larger bodies? So I'm going to leave that. Either of you can jump in to start. That's definitely a question for you both.
I would say like the answer to that for me would be both. Like we always are, in my mind, like different networks, like different assemblages. Like there's the assemblage that is my own body, and we can talk about that as an ecology, and it's in and of itself. And then there's also me within a greater system. So I just see it as a lot of Venn diagrams, a lot of networks. Like it's all overlapping. To me, it's an and, not an either or. But I love this question. Super, super thoughtful. Thank you for that.
I think for me, it is both. there's slightly more of an interconnectedness between the micro and the macrocosm, because it's all about positioning yourself on your proper path in relation to the whole rest of the system. And that just isn't contained to, the earth or the physical world. It really is a whole universal thing. That's why I call my blog Voodoo Universe, because it really does radiate out into the entire universe, and what your place is within that, and aligning yourself with that really does truly align yourself with both your destiny and your success at the same time. So, but certainly it affects, what I was talking about, it affects what we eat, it affects, how we sing, it affects how we move through the world, both very literally and also figuratively.
Thank you both so much. And I think that there is a lot of, there's a lot of interest in this. So I'm going to move on kind of immediately to a question from Lauren, which is a kind of pandemic positioning question. So Lauren says, I think the built environment and the urban/suburban world have taken on a new meaning in these days of lockdown. Has the last 12 months changed or influenced the way that you two see the relationship between magic, bodies, and ecology? Sabrina, I think that maybe if we started with you, because that you've been talking a lot about this idea of contagion and kind of the viral.
Yeah, great question. So for me, I don't think it's changed my perspective per se. It's more just that I'm seeing different iterations like in real time that kind of back up some of what my thoughts and observations have been for quite some time. What I love about this moment, though, in terms of thinking about magical practice, is a lot of folks tend to think about magic as this thing that we go somewhere else to do. Like we go out on a walk to the forest, or we go on a retreat somewhere. And what I love about this pandemic moment is that we're all kind of forced to find this reinvigorated presence in our homes where we are, and to think about our own living spaces as sites of magical interaction. And I love that more people are embracing that, sadly out of necessity. I wish there was some other inspiration for that. But to me, any type of thing that can switch our awareness of our environment as it is not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's nice to be very fully where we are.
Yeah, I think for me, it has sort of refocused the attention of everyone on some of these things that I personally have always had the attention on, and I think are inherent in a lot of the ATRs. If we talk about herbal magic or plant magic or things like that. It was so surprising to me to go to, the plant store the first week into the pandemic and everything's gone. It was just like, whoa, like that. I was not expecting that particular little turn, and also in conjunction with, as I was mentioning, it influences what we eat. So it influences, everybody's turning to cooking now. My daughter went to Ivy League cooking school and she's cooked for all these Michelin star chefs and everything. So I've always been a foodie. I was always, from 2 years old, she was by my side cooking and learning the magical and the physical and the spiritual and the health implications of those foods. So to see people turn to that now and be really creating those things for themselves, I think is so beautiful. And my whole take on this whole thing is what is it making us do differently that might actually be a positive force in our life? Because we can all sit there and make a giant list of things, people, places, things that we really miss, but what is it turning our attention to, and how can we use that to better educate ourselves and further our own spirituality until whatever word you want to use, we can go do that with other people again. So, and the other thing that I think it's done for me is, as I've always sort of been a techno witch, so this way of connecting this way, as much as I would really love to be in Cambridge right now, you have no idea. It's still lovely that I can connect with people and everybody out there that I would not necessarily have been able to at this moment in time. So that's where I sit with it.
Thank you both so much. And I think that for me, this idea that we have to know the places where we are in all of their complex animism, in all of their complex existence, as they are in the interstices between what we have and what we would choose, has been an amazing moment for for kind of magical growth, because we are becoming intimate with spaces that I think we often use as kind of sleeping and eating spaces rather than being spaces. I'm going to use my my chair privilege one more time. There's so many questions in the chat, and I'm going to solely concentrate on them in a minute. But I have a question for you both, which is, we are in an interdisciplinary seminar, and often that means bringing people who practice one strand of the discipline into conversations with people who practice one other discipline. And I am so happy to be in a space where we have both of you who are both academics and practitioners. And I just really wanted to kind of ask you the question that is, how does your academic practice relate to your magical practice? And do you have a sense of a message or a feeling or a kind of a shift that you'd like to suggest towards how we work between the spiritual or magical, the practical, let's say, and the theoretical or academic? You both in your talks make really deft movements between them, and I just wanted to kind of ask more about your experience straddling those fields.
I guess I'll start. I think for me, it's a pleasant thing to see in the movement of academia in general, away from sort of, this external and more of a blend participant observation kind of thing. I remember when I went back, the documentary program I did at NYU has reunions every 10 years. And when we went back for the last one, a good friend of mine was talking about how he had gone to the Amazon and put that camera in the hands of the indigenous people there to make their own film, and they made him pretend to be the evil European, and they beat him up and they made him speak bad Spanish while they robbed him. So for me, this was the most beautiful thing that I had seen in a long time. And then he could take that film around and explain what they really wanted to say. So for me, it's always sort of been about navigating those spaces in the academic world where I could have a voice and also have a voice of other people I knew that were genuine practitioners, and bring that voice to the academic community, where, especially in my discipline, where a lot of it is secretive, a lot of it has been illegal and maligned and stereotyped and all of that, even within academia, to be able to bring those voices to the fore so people could see them up close and personal, and to be able to present that and present their voice and my voice alongside each other. And that was something that was really beautiful for me. And on the practitioner side, I think that I stress, especially with my own students, the importance of community and the importance of getting accurate and respectful information out there. So even while they might be shy or might not be used to talking, I do stress that them creating their own narratives and putting it out there for people to consume in whatever way they feel comfortable about it is something that really is important. Especially the older I get, the more I see this, because all my work was because I didn't want the generations after me, my daughter, and anybody who came after that, to have to go through some of the struggles that I had concerning voodoo and concerning a lot of this misconception and stereotype.
Thank you so much for that, Lilith. I appreciate your perspective on this. Am I allowed to swear in this? Am I going to get censored by the internet? So I feel like being a witchy person in academia, honestly, is like the biggest pain in the ass. Like, I'm just going to say it. Like, this has been a joy to participate in. I'm so happy that we're finally at this point. But I've been doing witchy stuff in the academy since, oh my God, like forever, like 2007, I guess, if not a bit earlier. And like the amount of pushback is just absurd. Like the amount of pushback is absurd. And I'm sure, Lilith, you can probably relate to that. And like the amount of times I get asked, do you actually believe in this? Are you just being cute? Are you just doing this as like archetype? You don't actually believe that, right? You're just being like anthropologist, right? The amount of times I've been asked that is like completely like ridiculous. And so to me, it's been really fascinating to see like the different levels of acceptability with talking about witchcraft in academic spaces. For instance, like I'm in science and technology studies, and I'm very, very thankful to Isabel Stengers, who was also featured in this Magic and Ecology, because thanks to her work, I can do what I do and not be thought of as a complete nut job, basically, because she was doing a lot of innovative work in mixing science and magic conversation, which a lot of folks have done prior to that as well. But so there's interesting waves of movement within the academy. And so it's always interesting to me to see who has the privilege of speaking about magic without being dismissed. Like, who can do that in what circumstances? Who can speak about personal religious and spiritual experience in the academy without facing repercussions of being othered? Like, there's so much going on with that. I've got a lot of opinions. So it's been an uphill battle, I guess I'll say. It's been a serious uphill battle. And I'm sure that a lot of folks in my department do think I'm completely like nuts for actually practicing, not just talking about this as symbolic. At the same time, it was really important for me to take up space in the academy because I've seen so many folks who don't practice making work about witchcraft and magic. And while I do think that to some extent that can be valuable, it's been very frustrating for me to read these very popular academic books about witchcraft and be like, wow, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. Like, this person just talked to one group of Wiccans and then made a lot of big, broad, sweeping claims about what magic is. And so that is annoying to me. I understand, like, people are trying their best, etc. At the same time, I do think that the more practitioners that can straddle both of these worlds, be very, very serious about our practice, and then also, you know, be able to talk the talk and code switch in the academy can be really important, because then what we are actually doing can be represented in an accurate way, which to me is part of what motivates me. I want to make sure that I'm able to dispel some of the misinformation out there and circulating in the academy. So that's part of what motivates me, even though it's a bit of a pain at times.
Thank you both so much. And I think it has been a very fascinating experience to me as someone who is an academic and also a practitioner to see how those two things which I think of as so incredibly interlinked are perceived as so wildly differing. So thank you for voicing many of the thoughts that I also have had. So we now turn our attention back to questions. And there's two here that I'm going to sort of bring together because I think they're asking kind of a similar thing. So we have one from Erin and one from someone who goes by the initials ABS. Erin says, I'd love to hear more from Lilith and Sabrina about how co-creation and its relation to ecology is connected to the witchbody in their respective practices. And ABS asks, I was interested in hearing further discussion on mimetic magic, with an E, memetic, if you like, social media spellcraft and the influence of right-wing memes on us all in recent times, the transformative potential of these spells and their relationship to chaos magic. So I think those questions for me really resonate between the body of the self and the body of the world. So I'm gonna throw that kind of doubled question to you both. And maybe if Lilith, if you wanted to talk, I know that you've not really mentioned virality and kind of memes, but I'm sure you have thoughts, so feel free to straddle that as well in your reply.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, there's definitely a split within the tradition as to whether or not any of this really should be put out there. I see a younger generation of witches and magical people who do put a lot of spells and incantations and rituals and all of that stuff. And you know, I'm old school, the way I was raised, that you don't really do that, because there's something about allowing somebody to access, you know, it's like allowing somebody to access your underwear, you know, like this is something that's private. And if you want it to be effective, chances are, you know, like you got to keep control of that. So that's the one side of it. But I do think there are certain things that can be done, you know, with this medium that we couldn't do before. In Haitian Vodou, they have a divinity called Simbi, which is a serpent. And it went from originally having to do with magic and lightning quickness and electricity. And it sort of transferred itself now with the internet age to also being a Loa that deals with the internet and social media and all of these things. So it's beautiful that the system can evolve and incorporate new things. And in that particular thing, again, it has its usefulness in a particular niche. I think that memes in general are good for uniting people. Obviously, since I've done ritual with Dr. John and I've done ritual on stage with tens of thousands of people at one time, but that's a very different kind of thing. And I think for me, both personally and professionally, when I see it happening, it really does look like a very different kind of thing than if you're sitting there with your coven of, 12 other people, or if you're sitting there with a small group with focused intent, because you can't control the focused intent of 10,000 people. It does really tap into chaos magic, which I think the question was touching on. But then by definition, chaos magic is a loose cannon, so for me as a priestess, if you ask my priestess self, that could be tricky. If I was going to do something, I would probably choose to do it with a smaller group of people, because it would allow that intent and focus and purity of magic. One of the most beautiful things I think about the ATRs is sometimes in Lukumi, what they will do is they will have the prayers said by a parrot, because the parrot is not thinking about all these other kinds of who knows what the parrot's thinking about, but it's not like a person is thinking, oh, did I forget to turn the dishwasher off? Blah, blah, blah. The parrot is thinking much more immediate and having that focus and sending it out without all this attachment to it. And I think individuals have a lot of attachment to it when they come to the magical table, especially in a large kind of setting or out over the internet. You don't know what people are doing out there. So that's my feeling on it.
It's so interesting. I love that you're talking about whether to share magic or not. That's such a big generational split right now as well, which is super fascinating. And I have a lot of opinions about that in so many different ways, but I do want to touch on the memes piece, since I guess I brought that up in my talk. And so my thinking from this comes from, first of all, being a public person on the internet for the last few years, despite my best efforts, and reading a few interesting books lately. One of them is called Antisocial by Andrew Morantz, and it's about internet extremism. And the other book is by Jenny Odell, and it's called How to Do Nothing. And both of these books kind of got me thinking about the internet, about how do we kind of switch off from it. One of the things that was interesting that Morantz was talking about in the book Antisocial is very much about how these right-wing meme people, they really have created culture out of nothing. They really have, just through one tweet or a series of tweets that has gone viral, can impact and completely change the global conversation. And if you're skeptical, read the book. He talks about how do they do this? Why do they do this? But what's interesting to me with this is I see it as honestly a form of perhaps chaos magic, a form of very effective manifestation. So I'm on the left, obviously, perhaps. But I find it very interesting that on the left, we don't seem to be very good at mobilizing magic to get our shit done. I find that fascinating. But on the right, they seem to be quite talented at mobilizing these online pieces of memes as a form of chaos magic, sometimes intentionally, sometimes perhaps unintentionally. And I find it very interesting. They've been able to mobilize different bodies of knowledge online, physical bodies, we saw obviously the awful events at the Capitol building just recently, and that was something that happened quite quickly. Obviously, there's a lot to be said about that, the buildup over time, etc. This is my disclaimer. I'm oversimplifying right now. You guys know that. But I find it very interesting just to see how these different movements of online beings, online bodies, whether they be commenters or memes or whatever getting spread around, can actually change material culture in quite a concrete way. I just find that very interesting right now. I have no answers at all whatsoever, but I'm just noticing some of that as a form of magic. Obviously, it's maybe not my preferred form of magic. It's not the outcome that I would be personally into, but I find it very interesting how absolutely effective they've been at manifesting, really, in quite a speedy type of way, using these new tools of the internet. And so I'm wondering what occultists and witchy folks can learn from that. If there's a way that we can co-opt some of those methods and those tools for our own purposes, I don't know. It's just a lot of interesting stuff to observe in my mind. And so when I'm thinking about magic and ecology, I'm also thinking about stuff like that and the power of memes, because people often will write it off as like, oh, whatever, it's just kids on the internet being stupid. And I don't think that's necessarily true, as we saw just a few weeks ago.
And I think that also, for me, thank you both so much, taps into this idea that, Lilith, I really, really love this idea of the snake transferring its lightning speed toward the internet and encompassing that, because I think an extraordinary generational shift which is taking place, psychological shift among internet and non-internet users, it doesn't have to be generational, is to do with this idea that it is both a playground and a deadly serious thing, which is precisely, of course, what magic quicksilver's between. It is the very epitome, its fabric is made of the stuff, I think, that we encounter all the time in magic, which completely fascinates and terrifies me in equal measure. We have a question next directed for you, Lilith, but I'm going to open it up really to both of you. The question is from Carmel, and the question is, Lilith, can you speak to how you mention food and recipes in your work and how that speaks to our bodies and internalizing the ecology that we interact with? And Sabrina, I'd like to kind of extend that to you. I have great pleasure in watching the food of your Instagram stories, much of which I believe is prepared by your partner or lover, I'm not sure what they, and I'm super interested in this idea of nourishment and magic. So I'm going to open that up to you both.
That's wonderful. I love that people are asking about my recipes. I mean, for me, again, you have to nourish yourself, and you have to nourish yourself physically, and all of the things that you nourish yourself with also have spiritual properties. They have medical properties. They have energy vibrations that you can tap into. And for me, it's something that I see is something anybody can do. For me, magic is always something. It doesn't matter if you're 1 year old or if you're 100 years old. You know, you still have to eat. If you're old enough to stand up, you're old enough to cook. And look, I mushed my strawberry into some chocolate, you know, like these things. And how does it make you feel when you eat that? How does all these things? And I think it's something that, yes, you can use as the microcosm. And that's one of the reasons I came up with my cookbook too, because I think that food is to a large extent a way of connecting with the larger ecology of the world, very literally, but also connecting with your ancestral path, healing through those kinds of things by making those recipes, by communing with those foods on a deep level. And again, I mentioned, you know, if you can grow them as well. Like, this is something that I think it's knowledge that people had 100, 200 years ago that has been lost to a lot of us, unfortunately. I just grew my first sweet potato. I was so happy. Like, so I pulled it out of the ground. I was like, yeah. So, but this is something that we can do. We can all do. And it's something also that I think really comes from a place of love. And I know that almost unfortunately sounds like a cliche, because we've heard so many of these new age people say things like that. It comes from a place of love. But if I give you food because you're sick and I put healing herbs like thyme in it or something like that, and I go back through all the herbology of it and the medicine of it, and you know, where it came from, and it's organic, and it was something that was grown with care and intent and positivity. If this is not just something that's an ATR thing, we can see it cross-culturally. If we look in, you know, Hindu culture, they only have certain people in the kitchen. They only have certain people cooking. You know, in our traditions, if you're angry or mad, you can't go into the kitchen because that's going to transmute into the food. So this is something that was always really exciting to me, and something that I did witness, you know, as somebody who grew up with angry cooks. I did see what it was like to eat angry food. And now I know what it's like to eat happy food. And that's something that I try and, you know, avail me and those who are around me of as much as possible.
I love this question. And Lilith, I love everything you just said. I'm just like, yes, I hear you. I love this. It's such an amazing question. It's so important. So for me, this kind of links back to what I was saying in my video about the body as like a ground. Like, I think food is such a beautiful example of that, because we kind of merge together when we eat. And I actually have I was looking for, there's a scene in my book, which is actually taking place in the kitchen of cooking, making this exact point that something as simple as preparing a meal, whether for yourself or for other people, can be a form of witchcraft and magic. At the beginning of the pandemic, one of the first things I did was send out a blast to my newsletter about kitchen witchcraft. And okay, guys, we're getting serious about cooking at home. Like, here's some stuff that we can think about to work with all of these everyday things that we're always already doing. We all eat every day, I hope, to think about that in a magical capacity. And I love what Lilith is saying as well about how, like, if food has been cooked when someone is in a bad mood, you can really feel it. Like, you really notice the difference between food cooked with love and food not cooked with love. And Alice, you mentioned all the food that's been popping up on my Instagram. Yeah, guilty as charged. My partner has been cooking me like a bunch of different meals for the week. So like he just like rolls up every weekend with like 20 Tupperwares basically full of lots of different food. And like there's such a loving thing with that, you know, like it really is an act of love and an act of magic, in my opinion, like to be eating the food that someone who cares for you has prepared. Like there is something really, really lovely about that. And so, you know, if anyone's listening to this feeling somewhat disconnected from their magical practice, like I would argue that we only have to look so far as our kitchens, only look so far as the drinks in our coffee cups, or you know, the food in our fridges. It doesn't have to be quite so complicated as buying 20 crystals from the crystal store and waving around your incense. Like it can be as simple as preparing food for yourself or for someone else that you care about. Such an important part of existence, I feel. The magic in the mundane.
It absolutely is. Thank you both so much. And I was someone who, during my PhD, made a lot of cake at 3 a.m. that nobody would eat because it was just made purely of stress. My partner at the time used to call it, "Oh, you've made another weird stress food," because it was the antithesis of magic, but it was a way of kind of getting my stress out into an object, even if it then had to be, alas, put in the compost heap. So we move now to another question from Olivia, which I really love and which I think is kind of central to everything we've been moving ourselves around. And I'm curious to how you both came across your root belief behind animism. She says, "I tend to express animistic tendencies in how I interact with non-physical beings, but don't necessarily have an anchored belief in how I make sense of it." And she says, "I hope that makes sense." And I really think it does. So I would love to open that up to you both.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. For me, this is going to sound like a total cop-out, but it just came from like existing in reality. That sounds odd, I know, but I really didn't learn it from anywhere other than from the world around me. I learned it from just being a sensitive kid, I guess, and feeling the vibes of everything around me, feeling really bad. If a book got thrown across the room, I would feel bad for the book. Still do. You know, if something gets tossed in the ground, I feel like awful about that, to be honest with you, because like I see it as a disrespect to that being. And so like for me, it's just like I've always had this openness, I suppose, like to other beings as being relevant, I suppose, like that they're not inert. So I've just always felt that energy of everything that is outside of me. So I suppose you could say it just comes from an expanded noticing, like an attuning of my senses to those energies that are always around. It's a very, very cop-out answer, but that is like honestly kind of how I came to this belief, to this practice. Like it really just comes like grassroots, ground up, like from relating to the world around me. Cop-out, I know, I'm sorry.
I think so. I feel the same way. I think that I recognized that there were these energies and forces, and it sort of grew into names for it the same way that language grew, because for me, it really felt pre-verbal. I could certainly tell, maybe because I was just in an extreme environment, or maybe it's just, I don't know why it was, because I've had it forever. So I don't know where it came from, but I think I became highly sensitive to some of these energies that are around, and then eventually began to be able to put a name to it, and then to be able to put an actual practice and thought forms behind it, and to be able to I didn't initiate in any of these traditions until I was over 20, so it was more of being a solitary or somebody who did occasional ritual or something like that. But I didn't have the formalized training that I do now until I was an adult. I mean, there are plenty of people in this tradition who initiate when they are very young. My own daughter initiated when she was 6, so it is something that does happen. I just didn't have the opportunity to do it. And my Spanish is really bad. I think that's probably what it is. But I wasn't in that place where I could have these names for it, things like Ashe, like I was talking about before, or Orisha. I just thought it was, there were weird stores with Catholic statues in them when I was growing up in Brooklyn. And then eventually I realized, oh, I always thought they were really pretty. One of my younger friends said they look just like Disney princesses. And when I had that moment, I was like, wow, a lot of these Santo statues do look like Disney princesses, especially to a mind that's not going to distinguish in these forms. It's a long flowing dress. It's, stars falling off their hands. It's a crown. It's all of these things that we've sort of been fed under different guises. But once we peel back the layers and look at what's underneath it, we can see that we did get the Ashe of it, and it's been with us all along.
I think what you say there is completely true. And for me, I think there is this idea that animism meets us constantly, and it's when we are able to meet it back. And I think that happens very instinctively, often when we are very young. And then we are taught to kind of remove ourselves through cycles of consumption and waste. We're taught to remove ourselves from that animism and then often come back to it if we're drawn to it formally, when we are able to kind of give name to it. So thank you both so much. I have another question. They are pouring in. This one is preceded by quite a long comment, but I will skip to the question, which is, what is the ethical value that we can derive from magical and ecological thinking, or how do we give value without excluding or denying? Which I think is quite a complicated question in many ways, but I think that it is perhaps underpinned by this idea of where the ethics between magic and the environment kind of spring from.
Yeah, my whole book is about that, actually. My whole book is basically an answer to that question, because I was very motivated to write my book, advertisement, by this question of why are we not extending ethics to non-human beings? That was kind of my whole motivation. Let's talk about why that is, and then let's also talk about how we might think with magic as a way to help us expand notions of what beings deserve ethical treatment. So for me, that is part of the point of all of this. That is part of the point of a lot of my work is really thinking about, what does ethics mean? How can we extend ethics to more beings and be self-aware of that process? In my opinion, all beings are worthy of ethical consideration, of ethical treatment. What you see a lot sometimes in communities of, let's say, vegans or whatever, there's this idea that non-violence is actually possible. And I actually don't, even though I am vegan myself, I actually don't believe that non-violence is possible. To me, within my cosmology as an animist, as someone who believes all beings are beings and have a certain sense of liveliness, non-violence is only possible when we exclude certain beings from the category of being, in my opinion. And so where that kind of comes into all this conversation for me is it, in my opinion, can create more awareness around the choices that all of us are always making already. And just attuning to, hey, these choices aren't necessarily naturalized. They don't, they don't come just falling from the sky. Let's think about this a little bit more with self-awareness, with an awareness of what does this mean that we are, doing violence upon certain beings and maybe not on others. There's naturalized violence against certain bodies and not on others. And so for me, that's a lot of what's going on with this conversation, and why I believe that this expansion of ethical consideration for all beings is a crucial part of the conversation. I do believe that mass environmental catastrophe has happened in large part because many beings have been excluded from the realm of being and from ethical mattering. And so that's kind of the ethical piece for me, what's at stake with this conversation. Hopefully that makes sense. Read the book.
That's great. I think for me, it all plays back into our core belief system as far as when we're talking about the HERs, because it's talking about ethics and respect for all beings, because we see them as all interconnected. You know, I was thinking about this concept of garbage, and there's an Orisha of garbage, and we honor that in a different way than we honor, not the Orisha of fire. So these things are just something that we have different ways of respectfully interacting with these elements. And that's also in tune with ourselves and our own characters. And for us, the highest ethical position is to have good character. Now, in some certain, this is going to be confusing to people, I apologize, but in some certain situations, yes, there is animal sacrifice, and that is usually done to save a life, and it's done in extreme circumstances. And very often it's done with the practitioner being willing to give their own life in that situation. And I think when people take that into account, then it doesn't become, oh, I'm a higher being than this other being. It becomes that here's a situation that needs this particular solution. You have to be willing to give whatever it takes, either personally or in this situation with an animal or an herb you can sacrifice as well. We call it Igbo, that this something needs to be given. So it could be given from yourself, or it could be given from this other thing, but they're all interconnected. And this is, by doing this, it's better for the planet and everybody overall. So there is this sense of communal good and an attachment to ethics on that level, because we do what needs to be done for the communal good. And a lot of times personal will doesn't even enter into it. It's not, oh, I want this thing, like I want this big house. It's that maybe there's an illness in the community, maybe there's a division, maybe there's something else. And in order to heal the overall thing, these are the actions that need to be taken out, and everybody needs to get on board with those actions. So it really is more about thinking in a communal way, which I think really is more ecology minded, because we're all in this together. And when you think of it that way, it just sort of removes what's happening in your own little myopic kind of thing and allows you to see it as connected to other things.
Thank you both so much. And I think what I am drawn to in both of your work is this complex but evident commitment to developing what I call in my book an ethics of care for the felt environment. This idea that we move from the position of self into the position of world with as little ethical alteration as possible. But I like so much, and I'm so grateful that you have both spoken to and acknowledged necessary violence when it occurs, and framed that for us, because I think it's really vital not to prettify this idea that you can care for everything in some sort of extraordinarily detached, magical way, that everything is untouched. So we have, again, so many more questions. It's wonderful. We could be here, I think, for the next 12 hours. So we have a question from Lizzie, which begins with a quotation from a writer, A.N. Whitehead. There is a difference between objects which are societies of self-experiential beings versus actual entities which are more holistic beings, while still being made up of the same self-experiential beings, of which the building blocks of reality, which to me seems to speak to the individual and community, which you've both just touched on. So the question really is, what, if anything, differentiates the animal kingdom from the rest of reality? And I'm going to join that to the question below it, which I think speaks to it really well, which is, do you think practicing magic in the current state of environment and climate change should be encouraged from an early age? So I would like to open those two kind of connected questions about individuals and society to you both.
Wow.
Sure. It's a lot of stuff. I didn't think that anyone would be bringing up, I'm assuming that's Alfred Whitehead. Yeah, so the question, I'm just rereading it now in the chat. What, if anything, differentiates the animal kingdom from the rest of reality? Like, to me, that's not even the question that I would necessarily come at that with personally. Like, I'm curious about this like obsession with the animal kingdom that I see often. Like, for me, like my worldview is very much informed by object-oriented ontology, aka horizontal ontology. So we're all like this. Like, we all have something that differentiates us. Like, literally every being that exists, in my opinion, does have some kind of unique thing going on. Every being has something unique to offer. Every being has a unique experience of this thing called reality. And so, like, to me, like, that's Yeah, like it's not just about differentiating or distinguishing like the animal kingdom, so to speak. It's about noticing how distinct everything is from each other. There's wondrous difference all over the place. It's not just about this like animals over here and everything else. It's like, no, everything else is just infinitely fascinating and infinitely different, in my humble opinion. And then the second question, I'm just scrolling down to read it now. Do I think it should be taught from an early age? The should is an interesting word, isn't it? I'm not too sure about should. Magical. Pardon me?
It's doing some really, I think should is doing some really interesting lifting.
Yeah, should is an interesting question. I'm not too sure about the should. Magical folks are notoriously like anti-persuasion. Like we don't really recruit, like not really. And so the should for me is interesting, especially since magical practice, like one really does need to have a decent awareness of ethics, of what ethics might mean, of our weight in the world as we throw it around with the magic that we do, and the impact that we can have on everyone else around us. I've seen and heard of so often folks who are newer at magic, maybe they are younger in years or younger in practice, who have done like perhaps ill-advised magical workings that then I have to help them undo. Or, you know, teach them how to, okay, like let's reset this a little bit, like perhaps this wasn't the right way to go, let's talk about that. And so while I don't want to be ageist or anything like that, I know I definitely did some very ill-advised workings when I was in my early teens as well. So I also wonder about this should, like I wonder about like how is it taught, in what circumstances, by who, then people who don't practice, do they get ostracized? That's weird. Like I really don't think that a magical path is for everybody. Like I think if people are feeling in resonance with it, then for sure go for it. But just like, you know, being an artist or being a dancer, I don't believe that it's necessarily the path for everybody. I think we can acknowledge the existence and beauty of magic without all of us having to be ritual specialists ourselves. I don't necessarily think it's everyone's work to do. However, if folks do feel drawn to it, then I'm more than happy to create space for them in the community. I think I'm always happy to teach and to engage.
Okay, so my take on this. Okay, so first about the animals, since I did, you know, talk a little bit about sacrifice. For us, it's just a manifestation of Ashe in a particular context. I don't know if I talk about Veves in the video that I did, but there is sort of a participant element where people think they were possibly created by the animals that were there for a ceremony. So there is this kind of joining in by the animals on different levels. As I mentioned, the parrot joining in on different levels. So there is magic that we do that has animals as full participants, not necessarily in sacrifice, but as full participants in this way or another way, that help contribute what they can in their own special way to the ceremony. And it's, again, not a hierarchy. It's that you have your energy and I have my energy and this has this energy, and it's just something that we recognize and we pay attention to. I don't like the word should either, but I guess I'm gonna, you know, totally let it all hang out. I have taught magic to my own children. I was a, you know, nanny for many years. I fancy myself Mary Poppins. If you ask any of those kids right now, they'll tell you Lilith is a witch. She has potions. I remember one of the little boys said to me, I came back from Ireland and I was like, I hugged the Stone of Destiny and it didn't sing. And he was like, that's okay, Lilith. You're the king of witches. That's what is going on. So I was like, dude, I love you. He was like 5 years old. I was like, dude, I love you. You know, like, so they have an understanding of what's going on. So for me to share with them my understanding, I think without negating or squashing what they have, but if somebody said, oh, I can feel the tree is feeling this, I'm not going to negate that like most, you know, adults that weren't magical people. So no, it's not. There's no such thing as ghosts. There's no such thing as this, because I just don't think that's a good way to help raise up anybody. I don't want to be treated like that. So I'm not going to teach my younger friends that way either. I'm going to teach them what I know, be it cooking or gardening, or, okay, we heard a noise. It could be a ghost. It could be a friendly ghost. It could be, you know, the refrigerator making noises. Who knows what it is? Let's go investigate. You know, that's how I treat everybody. It doesn't matter if they're 2 or 100. That's how I treat them, because that's the kind of experience I want to have with everything that's around me. So that's how I see it. And the kids still see it that way. They get older and older as I get older and older, eek. But that's how and that's one of the things that I really loved about it. You know, there's been plenty of times when I've done psychic readings for people who were special needs and couldn't necessarily get the same experience as someone who didn't have those challenges. And this, by tapping into the Ashe, they can eat the food, or they can put cotton balls under their pillow, or they can do something else that helps them connect with the Ashe of the energy that they need in order to go on their proper path despite their limitations. So this is something that I found insanely beautiful, because I'm not one of those people who says, oh, you can't do this because you're too young, or you can't do this because you're differently abled than the person standing next to you. We all have our own strengths. And for me, magic is about finding out those strengths. You know, maybe somebody's good at divination, maybe somebody's good at ritual dance or ritual singing, or maybe somebody's good at writing, or maybe somebody's good just at meditation, and we can all learn from their power of stillness. So for me, it's about recognizing those strengths.
Thank you both so much. I think that what you have both touched on is this idea of the legitimacy of experience and resonance. And I find it very, very interesting that so many religions or practices, you can be a devotee and not a priest. And I think that the current way that we discuss magic invites everybody to, there are very few paths toward magic for simply those who are devotees, but who do not wish to themselves practice. And so people feel sort of falsely called, I think sometimes, that they have to do this thing to qualify, whereas actually being aware in the world is itself a form of magical engagement that does not require further ritual action. And I think you both touched on that beautifully. An amazing question. This is from Luminara. I would like to hear more about how you both view cosmetics as co-curating magic, but don't fall into the trap of societal pressure of how women's bodies should look. I know you're both non-binary, but how people's bodies should look. You both have a lot of kind of, I think we all have a lot of access to magical items, whether they're makeup or ritual alterations of body. And I was wondering if you would both speak on that.
It's a hard one. You know, there's certainly a tradition of, I'm here in New Orleans, there's a tradition of masking Indian, which is something that the Black people here in New Orleans started doing for Mardi Gras when they were outlawed from actually participating in the white people's Mardi Gras parades, and they joined with some of the indigenous people, and that's why they call themselves Indians. And what they do is they mask Indian, and it's sort of, they enter, for those of you who aren't familiar with the custom, they enter into dances and singing, and it's kind of like a rap battle. That's how I sort of saw it, as somebody who grew up with the beginning of rap battles in the 80s and everything like that. But they call each other out, and it's a way of settling disputes and things like that. So there is a way of masking and making yourself that, you know, you yell, if you see them walking down the street, you yell, pretty, pretty big chief, because they've spent the whole year sewing these costumes, praying over these costumes, making these beautiful things in order to go out to show their splendor, to show their heritage and things like that. And that's something, I've had one on, they weigh like 50 or 60 pounds. They're horrendously heavy, and they have feathers and all of this stuff. And it really is a beautiful cultural custom that's also attached to the spiritual and attached to the historical and attached to the pride that they have in themselves. So on that note, I think that's great. On the other side of things, somebody came out recently with an Oshun and Yemaya eyeshadow palette, which I kind of think is really not where we were going with any of this, that I don't have to initiate, or I don't have to read any books, or I don't have to do any practice, or I don't have to follow any rules. I can just put on eyeshadow. And I think when we create these things, it allows for sort of back-ending to the practices and accessing that really is not what it's all about. And as pretty as it was, it's very expensive, like $30. I couldn't afford it anyway. But I don't really think that's what it's about. I think that it's about something completely different. And I wish they didn't do things like that. That's just my personal opinion.
I feel you. That sounds awful. Oh my God. Yeah, it's interesting to notice the way that certain cosmetics brands have taken up some of this magical practice. Like I think Sephora or something got called out sometime a few years ago for having a tarot something or another. So yeah, awful. Great question though, in terms of cosmetics as co-curating magic, but not falling into the trap of society's pressure. Just rereading that now. I think it is interesting as a non-binary person to be answering this question as well. Obviously, I'm aware that I look a particular way, but to me, like all of this, like cosmetics, body modification, like I would expand cosmetics to actually just be like modified bodies in whatever way, like whether we want to think about hair cutting, dyeing your hair, putting on nails. Like I usually have like really long fake nails, but it's a pandemic, so I don't. Like I've got like surgical modifications as well. I've got like injections all over my face. Like I've got like a lot of stuff going on. I've got tattoos. And so for me, all of this stuff is an affirmation of like the co-constitutive nature of reality, of my body, of all the bodies that exist. And so whenever people are just talking about something like cosmetics or makeup or whatever, like as one form of, let's say, like body modification, I just love to expand it to think about how else do we create our bodies, whether that's through working out at the gym all the time, whether that's through eating certain foods and not eating other foods, whether that is through surgical modification, whether it's through something like getting an IUD, which I personally have, which makes me also think of Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, which is one of my favorite things I've ever read. But what she says in like one of the last lines of that is, I would rather be a cyborg than a goddess. And I think that is like really fascinating way to look at it. And so what she's talking about there, and what I like to move with an awareness of, is how like we are always co-constituted. We are always creating ourselves. We are always creating our aesthetic of our body, as well as that internal aspect of our body through what we consume, what we plop in our skin, all of this type of stuff. Like I feel the society's pressure thing about how certain bodies should look, like I feel like that's a bit of a slippery slope, especially like not being a straight cis person. Like I feel like there's a lot of assumptions there around, what, if someone's getting a particular surgery or wearing a particular amount of makeup, like who that action is for. Like I get my surgeries for myself. I get my Botox and fillers for myself. I get my long nails for myself. I truly don't give a shit what like men or whatever have to say about that. And so I think often like women or AFAB people often make even more assumptions than perhaps men do about, not to do too much of a binary thinking move here, but I think like even as AFAB people, it's important to catch ourselves about certain assumptions that we might make about certain cosmetic procedures or aesthetic procedures that other AFAB people are engaging with, or even any femme people of any gender presentation are engaging with. So like to me, it's just about personal agency and creating the world that we want to be, creating the body that we want to live in without shame. Because it's ultimately for ourselves. We have to live in our body for whatever way that happens to look or feel like on a day-to-day basis. So I don't think it's just as simple as, lipstick equals bad, boob jobs equals bad. Like, I don't necessarily think so. Like, I think it is so personal. And for me, each of my mods that I've gotten has been like quite a spiritual experience. Like actually, like I found like getting my facial fillers to be a very ancestrally healing practice. Why? Because my whole lower face looked a lot like my dad's side of the family, who like I don't have a good history with. And so through changing that, it actually completely healed a really huge aspect of that like ancestral trauma. And like that was an accident. I didn't expect that at all. And so I think it's important to think about like the accidental spiritual healing that can come through some of these processes as well. It's not just as simple as a vanity thing. And, I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with vanity either. So it's very personal, is the too long didn't read version of my little speech there. Great question though.
Thank you both so much. And I also think that there is an awareness in magical practice about what we can invite into our environment and into our bodies that changes us anyway. We all live through our dimensions of space and time. We are all always changing. And so the mastery we have over that is a form of agency among the rest of the world. So I am aware that it is now at 7:10 GMT. So we have 20 minutes, just under 20 minutes, to scoop up the rest of the questions. So you are welcome to keep adding your questions. If we don't get to them, I am really, really terribly sorry. It may well be that that you two feel that you wish to, there is a little tiny buffer of time jumped in before the call ends itself automatically. We may keep going a little longer, but there is no pressure at all. So please be aware now that if you do ask a question, and we would love them to still come in, we can't guarantee that we'll be able to give them space here. But both Lilith and Sabrina are beings on the internet, and as such can perhaps be contacted. So Lauren asks a question which has quite a long working its way in, but the question is all about personal awakening and practice. And she asks, how did you filter through all the beliefs, practices, streams, etc., and come to your own personal beliefs and practices? I feel like I'm much more drawn to a mishmash of so much, and having grown up in the Catholic Church, I'm quite turned off by organized religions. Lauren is a student of mine, and I can say that her approach is really fantastically eclectic. So I'm fascinated to hear what you both have to say.
I think there's a definite distinction that I make between this kind of, negative attachment that people get to dilettante behavior, and more of creating some kind of bricolage of things that you find useful and work for you, in the reality, because everything is not going to work for everybody. I mentioned before, some people are going to be better at certain things, some people are going to be better at other things. And I think that if you can't necessarily work with that in and of yourself, then maybe you can find somebody else to partnership and work with, or maybe you can find something in your environment to work with. It's funny, I recently, last year, but very recently, nobody knows what day it is, October, I published a book on water magic. And it was funny because a lot of people came and talked to me about the different manifestations of water in their life in relation to the body, in relation to the planet. And then some people would come to me and they'd be like, I don't work with any of the other elements. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. You know what I mean? Because I started thinking about but there are other elements around you, there's earth underneath your feet, and there's, there's all the air that you're breathing, there's all these other things that you can choose not to necessarily work with magically, but they're still presenting themselves in your environment. So for me, I think that, yes, before my training, I had lots of things where I was just sort of gleaning knowledge from whatever was useful in that moment. And if that works for you, then keep going with it. That's always been my thing about everything, as long as you're not necessarily doing something to ruin everything all around you all the time. Nobody wants to have a Thanos moment. We're like, we're not going to get through this. So we have to be, at least cognizant of that. Our actions have results. So that's where that is. But that's just how it works for me,
Love that. As I like to tell people, I'm not initiated in jack shit. My knowledge all comes from the spirits and from the land, and through doing this for literally 20 years. And so I also think that that's a completely legitimate way to come to practice. Because I've met some folks who are initiated in, let's say, Wicca or some other initiation-based practice who don't really know what they're talking about, unfortunately. So I don't while I think there is a lot to be said for initiations as being incredibly valuable in some traditions, that's going to be the only way to go about it, but I don't believe that is necessarily the path that's going to resonate with everyone. So Lauren, your question is super awesome. I'm just rereading it in the chat now, and I think a lot of folks can resonate with that experience. I think you brought up something super, super important, and as I don't want to plug myself too much here, but since I've heard this so much in my work in the community, I did decide to make a course on magic. And actually the first module in that course is on cosmology and belief. Because I feel like that aspect is left out of so many books about how to do witchcraft, like what is witchcraft and all of this type of thing. And so I actually think that it's super important for folks to start there. Like, what do you believe? And if that is some mishmash of Catholicism and Buddhism or whatever, like I don't personally see the issue with that if that's what resonates with you. You know, like I think that that's completely fine. And I do think that taking that time and space to figure out, like, what does the world look like to me? What do I believe in? What spiritual entities do I even want to hang out with and talk to and petition for A, B, C, D thing? Who do I want to build relationship with? That to me is a huge, like, important thing to kind of think about and start with. Like, are you an animist? Are you not an animist? Are you more interested in polytheism, or are you actually a monotheist at the end of the day? Or are you an atheist and you still are interested in magic? Like, I think there's room for everybody. And so, like, when I am teaching this, like the way that I've structured my course is actually to make space for this type of experience, because I think it's such a common type of experience to, and so I really don't think that like we all need to be clones of each other. You know, in the magical community. Like, I think there is something really beautiful about creating space for other people to, which is what I try to do in my own teaching experiences, to create space for people to meet themselves and to find out what does this magical practice look like for them. Like, some folks might be really drawn to water magic. Some folks might be like, oh, I hate taking baths, screw that. I don't want to work with any plants. I just want to work with candles and that's it. Okay, cool, awesome. Like, I think there is room for that. And I think a part of it, as far as I'm concerned, is also just learning to trust that inner voice, learning to trust that inner knowing, learning to trust the conversations we're having with the spirits that we're building relationships with, or even just the land around us that we're building relationships with. Like, to me, that is kind of like the locus of it all. And like, the proof is in the pudding. Like, as you work with the magic and work with the beings that you're working with over time, like, you will start to feel different. Your life will start to feel different. It doesn't matter if your magic doesn't look exactly like mine does. That's not the point. And that's not why I teach. I don't want to create like cookie cutter versions of myself. That is not in any way what I want to do. It's all about creating space for people to carve out their own paths, as far as I'm concerned. And I do think that this more eclectic experience is super common. And like, I do work with a lot of students who do come from a more Christian background and who are grappling with that. You know, on one hand, feeling guilty or worried that they're going to get in trouble, or is this bad, or how do I make space for both of these parts of my belief systems? Like, I think it's such a common experience. So thank you so much for sharing that, Lauren. So I think a lot of folks will be able to find resonance in that. I think it's very personal, is the short version.
I think it really is. And I think one of the things that we teach and that the course is really centered around is this idea that it is not for us to tell you how to do it. It is for us to facilitate you finding ways that suit you. And I think it's one of the vital things. I mean, I think also in the British history of witchcraft, initiation forms a backbone of the immediate post-1950s model of witchcraft, which comes with its own difficulties. And whilst I am enormously respectful of those traditions, they have never been, I think, especially for people who live, for example, outside the binary, they are perhaps a very difficult thing to approach. So we try and kind of build a space where our students can find and be approached by what is required for them in a safe environment. It sounds like you do too, and I think that's the way to do it. But Lilith, I'm also very respectful of all initiated things, because I think they offer a community and focus that can be very difficult to cultivate on one's own, especially at the beginning. So we are so close to our time. So what I am really, really interested in is just kind of moving myself through some final questions. Matty has a beautiful comment that's very long that I'm not going to kind of touch on, but it's all about ethical coexistence and the alt-right, which, Sabrina, I feel like is for you. I'm gonna go with a really lovely question from Lindsay, and they ask, Could you each share an idea for a small, regular change that all of us can do to be both more environmentally sustainable, and more magical? So I'm going to open that to you.
Lilith, do you want to go first?
I'm thinking. I'm trying to think of something that's both of those things. I mentioned before I had the water magic book, and one of the things I do in there, I guess, because water is something that, we need to drink water, even if it's in the form of coffee or tea. Like we're ingesting water on a daily basis. If we're even remotely healthy, there's some kind of water-based liquid that's going into our bodies. So for me, making that into a more magical experience, I have my godkids, when they first start out, to leave water for their ancestors on their ancestor altar, or leave it out on the ground, or even to use it to water a plant. So this sort of interconnectedness, both with, again, the physical body and also the larger, wider body of the world that we can connect with through the element of water. Literally our bodies are mostly water. So even if you don't want to work with that element, your mind, your heart, and the whole rest of your actual body is mostly made up of water. So I think it's interesting to just be mindful of that. And that, for me, allows you to access another level of connection to it, and therefore another level of magic in your own life because of that. So I won't tell you, put a salt water bowl under your bed, although you can, that'll help you sort of refine your thoughts and refine your sleep and refine your magic. That's always a really good, simple thing for people to do. But if you want to do any of the other things I mentioned, those are really good things too, that are, again, simple, and everybody has water, hopefully, unless you're Flint, Michigan, which is very sad. But
I love that. Water is my favorite. I guess I'll share an exercise that I invite my magic students to do in one of the first modules of the course, which is on energy work. And so I find that harnessing an ability to notice the energies around us can be an incredibly important thing to learn how to do. And so one of the exercises that I invite my students to do is to go for what I call an energy walk. And so what that basically involves is going on a walk around your neighborhood, in perhaps a park near you. And as you're walking, see if you can try to expand your awareness to notice the shifting energies on that walk. Maybe you notice that you're feeling like a lot of tension in one particular area of the walk. Maybe you notice that you feel a lot of calm, peaceful vibes in a completely different area. Notice, where do you feel yourself pulled? Where do you feel yourself repelling away from? And to just notice the ebbs and flows of your own body in relationship to that path that you're walking. So I think if you decide to walk that a few different times, perhaps every day for a few weeks, you might notice some energy patterns. You might notice, oh, I feel really, really drawn to this little section of the creek every single time. That's interesting. And so I love this exercise. It's something that I do all the time. I love it because it cultivates an increased awareness of the energies that are around us at all times. And so when we're thinking about everyday typical stuff to do to infuse our lives a little bit more magic, I love this because you don't have to buy anything. You don't have to put on any particular outfit. You can just do it as a normal part of your day. And what it really is like learning a language. Like I really do feel like developing a practice of energy work is kind of like learning a new language to folks who aren't that used to engaging with the spiritual. And so it just takes practice. And so just expand your awareness. Notice, where in your body do you feel this tension? Where do you feel the peace? Where do you feel the pulls from here to there? Where do you feel like a bad vibe? Where do you feel a good vibe? Do you feel differently? Maybe you had an argument with your partner before you go for the walk. Maybe you feel completely closed off as a result of that. So what I would love to just invite folks to do is to try to, just open yourself to developing a practice as simple as that. Maybe taking some notes after each walk and noticing what you notice, I think is a really beautiful way to just expand your awareness of the energy around you and the magic that is everywhere, always, all the time.
Those are two incredibly beautiful and incredibly actionable answers. And I love this idea that that when we make small changes, they always have to be accessible and actionable, and that does not in any way alter their extraordinary transformational potential. So Emma comments that she composts her tea bags and thanks the herbs in them for their magic, and I think that's really lovely. And I love the it really reminds me of your comment about the Orisha of garbage, which I think is a very important thing. We have 5 minutes left, and what I kind of wanted to invite you both to do is speak a little bit, if you wouldn't mind, about what is next for you both. So what are you currently working on? What are you excited about? And also, if you can think of anything, if there's anything that moves you, what are you reading, anything that you'd super recommend to our magic and ecology audience? Are there some names that you'd like to lift up of other kind of practitioners or writers in any field, academic or practical? So over to you both for your kind of work and your recommendations.
So I'm currently writing my next book. It's going to be published with Penguin, which I'm feeling very fancy about. So hooray for me. It's going to be called Curse and Cure. And so that book is, it's the Magic 101 book that I've always wanted, but has never existed. And so it's going to be a very non-denominational book about magic and witchcraft, very similar perspective that you've kind of seen expressed today. And it's also going to include a lot of critiques of the spiritual industry, the spiritual wellness industry. Like, part of my motivation to write the book is to talk about how, like, sometimes these spaces that we go to for healing can sometimes be harmful in other ways. And so navigating what does that mean, trying to step away from the impetus to spiritually bypass and, actually going through those shadows, meeting ourselves in the dark places when it's necessary to do so. So I'm really, really excited to be working on that. The team I'm working with is awesome. Really, really excited. Otherwise, I am, oh my God, what am I doing? I'm teaching a few different classes online. So I've got online courses in group coaching programs. So one on tarot, one on magic. So if you're interested in that, please pop me a hello. And that is what I spend most of my time doing, honestly, writing the book, working on my courses, teaching my students, reading tarot, working on the PhD every now and then when I have got the time. I do post a lot about what I'm reading on my Instagram, so if anyone wants to check that out, Sabrina M. Scott. But as I'm sitting here, I've got a few books in front of me, so I might as well just show you guys a few books that I'm citing as I'm writing my book. So let's see. This is like very impromptu, sorry guys. So this one is pretty interesting if you're interested in an anthropological stance on what does ritual mean. If you're interested in spiritual bypassing, this book is pretty important and interesting. This one is fascinating if you're interested in like spiritual teachers and leaders who are sketchy and noticing some of those dysfunctional behavioral patterns. I thought this book was also pretty interesting. It's about yoga cults. Academically, talking about philosophy, Sarah Ahmed. I love this book, The Promise of Happiness. It's a great critique of the happiness industry and happiness culture and why do we always have to be happy all the time. Very, very interesting. And actually, I've got a few more that I can show you guys. What am I reading? Don't ask an academic to show the books. You're going to get like 20 books. So this book is amazing. Terror, Love, and Brainwashing. It's really, really interesting. Talks about attachment theory as it relates to dysfunctional groups. Very, very relevant to anyone who's interested in the spiritual industry.
Rena?
Yeah.
I am going to very gently move from this beautiful bibliography.
One more interesting book. Anyway, that's it. I read too many books, you guys, so now I'm going to shut up. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you. Just aware of the time. Lilith, would you please bring us your answer? Oh, you're on mute.
Muted. Oh no. Okay. I just wanted to remind everybody about I did come out with Orisha's Goddesses and Voodoo Queens last year along with Water Magic. And the one thing I'm very excited about, my first book, Voodoo and Afro-Caribbean Paganism, is going to be reprinted with a whole new chapter about Black magic and protest magic. And that's going to be reprinted by Warlock Press, hopefully by May of this year. So I'm very excited about that. I have a couple more online projects that I'm excited about. I started a YouTube show with a dear friend of mine, Jason Winslade, HD called The Pop Culture Show, talking about pop culture and the occult. So that's really fascinating. I'm starting a new IG TV show with Witch With Me, which we're going to be talking about my blog, Voodoo Universe, which is still going on, and different themes having to do with ATR, Voodoo World, and Black Witchcraft. So those are my couple of projects now. There's obviously classes. There's a ton of events. People can just check out my website to see where I'm going to be and what's up. So
Lilith,
thank you so much.
What are you reading? I want to know what you're reading
What
too.
am I reading? I'm reading a whole bunch of stuff, man. I know I didn't get any kind of advance warning here. Like what I'm reading almost every day, if I was going to give one recommendation of what people should run out and read right now, is Jodorowsky's Psychomagic. I read it almost every day. Like if you haven't read it. And I got to meet the maestro. He shook my hand. Like, oh, it was beautiful, beautiful. I'm such a Jodorowsky fan. Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Love that book.
Thank you so much, both of you, for bringing this extraordinary energy and presence and insight that we have all been so lucky to benefit from. It has been the fastest hour and a half, perhaps, of my life. So thank you both. I have some closing words, but first I would just invite you in the audience to join me in thanking our speakers. Please do look for their websites, their upcoming events, follow them on social media. It is so important that we continue doing the good work of interdisciplinary learning. So even if you are entirely non-magically inclined and purely coming at this from an academic standpoint, I invite you, please, to move into the magic of both of these people's worlds. So I'm now going to just close for us all. Thank you for joining us. Details of future seminars and events can be found at crash.cam.ac.uk and on the Magic and Ecology website, which is Magic Ecology, no space, .crash.cam.ac.uk. You can also follow on Twitter at Ecology Magic. Thank you both, Lilith and Sabrina. Have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you so much, audience. And the project will see you in 2 weeks. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.